the American Civil War stands as a pivotal crucible in human history, forging the fate of a nation and testing the mettle of its people. It was a conflict that would ultimately claim the lives of over 600,000 soldiers and civilians, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's psyche. The battle lines of yesterday continue to shape the America of today. In the sweltering summer of 1850, the United States teetered on the precipice of chaos as the fragile balance between the northern and southern states began to unravel. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed just 4 years prior, had reignited the simmering debate over slavery, allowing new states to decide for themselves whether to permit the institution within their borders. This contentious legislation had sparked a maelstrom of protests, petitions, and passionate oratory as abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates clashed in a struggle that would ultimately prove irreconcilable. As the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., became a hotbed of political intrigue, the likes of Senators Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun engaged in a high-stakes game of legislative brinksmanship. The Compromise of 1850, brokered by these elder statesmen, had attempted to placate both factions by admitting California as a free state, strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, and banning the slave trade in the District of Columbia. However, this tenuous compromise merely papered over the deepening chasm between the North and South as each side continued to dig in its heels. In the midst of this tumultuous landscape, a new generation of leaders began to emerge. Men like Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown Illinois lawyer, who would soon find himself at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. Lincoln's humble beginnings, marked by hardship and self-education, had instilled in him a profound respect for the principles of liberty and equality enshrined in the Constitution. As he traveled the lecture circuit, delivering impassioned speeches against the expansion of slavery, his reputation as a formidable orator and thinker began to spread. Meanwhile, in the South, firebrands like John Brown, a radical abolitionist with a penchant for violence, were secretly planning a campaign of guerrilla warfare against slaveholding interests. Brown's exploits, including the infamous Potawatomi massacre in Kansas, had already earned him notoriety and a price on his head. Yet, his unwavering dedication to the cause of emancipation would soon inspire a new wave of militants willing to take up arms against their Southern brethren. The presidential election of 1856, which saw James Buchanan, a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, assume the White House, only served to heighten tensions. With the Supreme Court's landmark, Dred Scott decision looming on the horizon, which would effectively nationalize slavery and invalidate the Missouri Compromise, the very fabric of the Union began to fray. In the midst of this gathering storm, the nation's attention turned to the Kansas Territory, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were engaged in a bitter struggle for control. The town of Lawrence, a bastion of abolitionist sentiment, had become a magnet for militants from both sides as the conflict escalated into a series of violent skirmishes and massacres. It was here, in the heartland of America, that the first shots of the Civil War would eventually be fired, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of the nation's history. The year 1859 would prove to be a watershed moment in this unfolding drama, as John Brown's ill-fated raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, brought the country to the brink of war. On a chilly autumn morning, Brown and his band of insurgents launched a daring assault on the Federal Armory, hoping to spark a slave rebellion that would spread throughout the South. Though the raid ultimately ended in failure, with Brown's capture and execution, it served as a clarion call to action for both sides, as the nation careened towards an inevitable confrontation. As the year 1859 drew to a close, the execution of John Brown on December 2nd sent shockwaves throughout the nation, with many in the North hailing him as a martyr for the abolitionist cause. The raid on Harper's Ferry had failed to spark a widespread slave rebellion, but it had succeeded in galvanizing public opinion and pushing the country ever closer to the precipice of war. In the South, Brown's actions were seen as a stark reminder of the threat posed by radical abolitionists, and many began to call for greater measures to protect their institutions and way of life. In the months that followed, the political landscape continued to shift and churn as politicians and activists on both sides of the divide struggled to navigate the treacherous waters of sectionalism. In the North, Abraham Lincoln's star continued to rise as he delivered a series of powerful speeches and lectures that showcased his mastery of rhetoric and his deep commitment to the principles of liberty and equality. His Cooper Union Address, delivered in New York City on February 27, 1860, was a particular triumph, as he laid out a nuanced and compelling argument against the expansion of slavery and in favor of a more perfect union. Meanwhile, in the South, a new generation of fire-eaters was emerging, men like William Lowndes Yancey and Robert Barnwell Rhett, who were determined to push their region towards independence and self-determination. These radicals were driven by a deep-seated fear that the North would ultimately succeed in imposing its will on the South, and that the institution of slavery would be destroyed as a result. They saw Lincoln and his fellow Republicans as existential threats, and they began to make plans for a potential secession from the Union. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, the country was more divided than ever before. The Republican Party, with Lincoln at its head, was committed to stopping the spread of slavery and promoting the interests of the North. The Southern Democrats, led by John C. Breckinridge, were determined to protect their region's institutions and way of life, even if it meant seceding from the Union. The Constitutional Union Party, which had emerged as a compromise between the two extremes, was led by John Bell, but its chances of success seemed slim. The election itself was a contentious and hard-fought affair, with all four major candidates, Lincoln, Breckinridge, Bell, and Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, campaigning vigorously across the country. In the end, it was Lincoln who emerged victorious, carrying all of the northern states and winning a majority of the electoral votes. But his victory was not universally acclaimed, and many in the South saw it as a direct threat to their very existence. In the weeks and months that followed, the situation continued to deteriorate as one Southern state after another began to secede from the Union. South Carolina led the way, voting to leave on December 20, 1860, and it was soon followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. The die had been cast, and the country was now irretrievably set on a course for war. The winter of 1860 to 1861 was a time of great uncertainty and anxiety as the country teetered on the brink of chaos. In Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan struggled to respond to the crisis, but his efforts were ultimately ineffectual. The outgoing president seemed paralyzed by the situation, and his inability to take decisive action only served to embolden the secessionists. As the Confederacy continued to coalesce, its leaders began to make plans for a potential war with the North. They knew that they would be outnumbered and outgunned, but they were determined to defend their new nation and its institutions at all costs. In the North, meanwhile, Lincoln and his fellow Republicans were preparing for the worst, knowing that the coming conflict would be long and brutal. In the midst of this gathering storm, a small group of Southern leaders made one final attempt to find a peaceful solution to the crisis. Led by former President John Tyler, these men proposed a series of compromise measures, including the creation of a new state in the territories and the protection of slavery in the border states. But it was too late, and the country was now too far gone. The die had been cast, and the war that would soon engulf the nation was all but inevitable. As the spring of 1861 approached, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. grew increasingly tense. Lincoln, who had been inaugurated as president on March 4th, was determined to hold the Union together, even if it meant using force to do so. He knew that the coming conflict would be a test of wills, and he was steeling himself for the challenges ahead. In the South, meanwhile, the Confederacy was putting the finishing touches on its preparations for war. Its leaders had established a new government with a constitution and a set of laws, and they were now busy raising an army and preparing their defenses. The first shots of the war were fired on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire on Union troops at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The battle was a brief but intense one, and it ended with the surrender of the Union garrison after just 34 hours of fighting. The war had begun, and it would soon spread across the nation, engulfing cities and towns from Virginia to Texas. As the news of the attack on Fort Sumter spread, the North rallied behind Lincoln and the Union cause. Volunteers flocked to join the army, and the government began to mobilize its resources for a long and bloody conflict. In the South, meanwhile, the Confederacy celebrated its victory, but it knew that the war was far from over. The two sides were now locked in a struggle that would test their strength, their courage, and their resolve, and only time would tell which one would emerge victorious. The first year of the war was marked by a series of Confederate victories, as the South's more experienced generals outmaneuvered and outfought their Union opponents. The First Battle of Bull Run, fought on July 21, 1861, was a particularly humiliating defeat for the North, as a confident Union army was routed by a smaller but more disciplined Confederate force. Despite these setbacks, Lincoln remained resolute, and he continued to rally the nation behind the Union cause. He delivered a series of powerful speeches, including his famous address at the special session of Congress on July 4, 1861, in which he laid out the principles of the war and called for a renewed commitment to the fight. As the war dragged on, the Confederacy began to face its own set of challenges. The Union Navy had established a blockade of southern ports, which was crippling the region's economy and making it difficult for the Confederacy to import the goods it needed to survive. The South was also facing a severe shortage of manpower, as its armies were depleted by casualties and desertions. Despite these difficulties, the Confederacy continued to fight on, driven by its determination to preserve its independence and way of life. Its leaders knew that the war would be long and brutal, but they were willing to do whatever it took to emerge victorious. As the year 1862 dawned, the war was entering a new phase. The Union Army was beginning to gain the upper hand as its generals learned from their mistakes and developed new tactics and strategies. The Confederacy, meanwhile, was facing increasing pressure from within as dissent and disillusionment began to erode its resolve. As the Union Army gained momentum, General Ulysses S. Grant emerged as a key figure in the Western Theater, where he had been appointed commander of the District of Southeastern Missouri. In February 1862, Grant launched a campaign against the Confederate stronghold at Fort Donelson, located on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. The Union Army besieged the fort, and after a series of intense battles, the Confederate garrison surrendered on February 16, 1862. This victory marked a significant turning point in the war, as it gave the Union control of the Cumberland River and opened up the door to further advances into the South. The fall of Fort Donelson was soon followed by another important Union victory at the Battle of Pea Ridge, fought on March 6 to 8, 1862, in northwestern Arkansas. This battle pitted a large Union army under the command of General Samuel R. Curtis against a combined force of Confederate and Native American troops led by General Earl Van Dorn. Despite being outnumbered, the Union Army emerged victorious, and the Confederates were forced to retreat from the region. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Theater, General George B. McClellan was leading the Union Army of the Potomac in a series of operations against the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. In March 1862, McClellan launched a massive amphibious assault on the Virginia Peninsula, with the goal of capturing Richmond and ending the war quickly. However, the campaign was marked by slow progress and indecision, as McClellan repeatedly delayed his advance and allowed the Confederates to prepare defensive positions. As the Union Army inched its way up the peninsula, it encountered fierce resistance from the Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31 to June 1, 1862, resulting in a tactical draw but significant casualties on both sides. Despite this setback, McClellan continued to push forward, and by mid-June his army had reached the outskirts of Richmond. However, just as it seemed that the Union was on the brink of capturing the Confederate capital, General Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate forces and launched a series of bold counterattacks against McClellan's army. The 7 Days Battles, fought from June 25 to July 1, 1862, were a series of intense battles that pushed the Union Army back down the peninsula and ultimately forced McClellan to withdraw his troops. The failure of the Peninsula Campaign marked a significant turning point in the war, as it allowed the Confederacy to maintain control of its capital and gave Lee the opportunity to launch a new series of operations against the North. In the midst of this shifting landscape, President Lincoln was grappling with the issue of emancipation as he sought to find a way to bring an end to the war while also addressing the moral imperative of freeing the slaves. In July 1862, Lincoln drafted a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation, which would declare all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. However, he hesitated to issue the proclamation, fearing that it might alienate border states and undermine support for the war effort. As the Union Army regrouped and reassessed its strategy, General John Pope was appointed to lead a new army in the Eastern Theater with the goal of defeating Lee's forces and bringing an end to the war. Pope's Army of Virginia was formed by consolidating several smaller units, and it set out to confront the Confederates in northern Virginia. The Second Battle of Bull Run, fought on August 29 to 30, 1862, was a decisive Confederate victory that marked a significant turning point in the war. Pope's army was defeated by Lee's forces, and the Union suffered over 16,000 casualties. The battle was a testament to Lee's strategic genius and his ability to outmaneuver his opponents. As the Confederacy celebrated its victory at Second Bull Run, General Lee began to contemplate a new campaign, one that would take his army into the North and potentially bring about a negotiated peace. The invasion of Maryland, which would become known as the Antietam Campaign, was a bold and ambitious plan that would test the mettle of both armies and push the war to new heights of intensity and drama. On September 4, 1862, Lee's army crossed into Maryland, marking the first time that Confederate forces had entered Union territory. The invasion sparked widespread panic and alarm in the North, as citizens and politicians alike wondered if the Confederacy was on the brink of winning the war. As Lee's army marched deeper into Maryland, it encountered stiff resistance from the Union Army, which was now led by General McClellan once again. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, in what would become the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. The fighting was intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Although the battle was tactically inconclusive, it marked a strategic victory for the Union, as Lee's army was forced to retreat back into Virginia. The aftermath of Antietam saw Lincoln issue his Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. The proclamation marked a significant shift in the war's purpose and paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery. As the Union Army regrouped and prepared for its next move, it was clear that the war had entered a new phase, one that would be marked by even greater challenges and opportunities than what had come before. The autumn of 1862 saw the Union Army launch a series of operations against the Confederacy, including a campaign in Kentucky and Tennessee. As the year drew to a close, the war was far from over, but it was clear that the Union had gained the upper hand. The Confederacy was facing significant challenges, including a severe shortage of manpower and supplies, as well as a growing sense of disillusionment among its citizens. The winter of 1862-63 saw both armies regrouping and reassessing their strategies as they prepared for the next phase of the war. The Union Army was now led by General Ambrose Burnside, who had replaced McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Burnside's tenure was marked by a series of disastrous battles, including the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was fought on December 11 to 15, 1862. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a crushing Confederate victory that saw the Union Army suffer over 12,000 casualties. The battle marked a low point for the Union war effort and raised questions about Burnside's leadership and competence. As the year drew to a close, it was clear that the war was far from over and that the next phase of the conflict would be just as intense and dramatic as what had come before. As the winter of 1862-63 drew to a close, General Joseph Hooker, the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, began to formulate a plan to defeat Lee's army and bring an end to the war. Hooker's strategy involved a bold maneuver, in which he would divide his army into several columns and launch a simultaneous attack on Lee's forces from multiple directions. The plan was ambitious, but Hooker was confident that it would succeed, given the significant numerical advantage enjoyed by the Union Army. In late April 1863, Hooker's army began to move out of its winter quarters and march towards the Rappahannock River, where Lee's army was encamped. The Union Army was organized into several corps, each consisting of multiple divisions, and Hooker had assigned specific tasks to each corps as part of his overall plan. The Cavalry Corps, led by General George Stoneman, was tasked with raiding behind enemy lines and disrupting Lee's supply lines, while the Infantry Corps were assigned to launch a series of frontal assaults on Lee's defenses. As the Union Army approached the Rappahannock River, it encountered stiff resistance from Lee's troops, who were well entrenched behind a series of fortified lines. Hooker's plan called for his army to cross the river at several points and then converge on Lee's forces, but the Confederates were prepared to defend their positions at all costs. On April 30, 1863, the Union Army launched its attack, with the corps of General John Sedgwick and General Joseph Reynolds leading the way. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they clashed in the dense woods and muddy fields around Chancellorsville. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's army fought tenaciously, taking advantage of the rugged terrain to launch a series of surprise attacks on the Union troops. Meanwhile, Hooker's plan began to unravel, as his corps failed to coordinate their attacks and became bogged down in the mud and confusion. On May 1, 1863, Lee launched a bold counterattack, led by General Stonewall Jackson, which caught the Union Army off guard and sent it reeling. The Confederates poured through a gap in the Union lines, exploiting a weakness that had been created by Hooker's decision to divide his army into separate columns. As the Union troops stumbled backward in disarray, Lee's army pursued them, inflicting heavy casualties and shattering the morale of the Union Army. The Battle of Chancellorsville was a decisive Confederate victory, one that would go down in history as one of the greatest military triumphs of the American Civil War. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's army had outmaneuvered and outfought the Union troops, inflicting over 17,000 casualties and shattering the confidence of the Union High Command. As the Union Army retreated back across the Rappahannock River, it was clear that the war was far from over and that the Confederacy still had a significant advantage on the battlefield. In the aftermath of Chancellorsville, Hooker's leadership was called into question, and he would eventually be relieved of his command by President Lincoln. Lee and his formidable Confederate army. As Lee's army began to march north into Pennsylvania, the Union Army would be forced to respond, launching a series of desperate attacks to stop the Confederate invasion and defend the North. The battle that would unfold at Gettysburg would be one of the bloodiest and most decisive of the war, with over 50,000 casualties and an outcome that would determine the course of the conflict for years to come. In the weeks leading up to Gettysburg, Lee's army was on the move, marching through the Shenandoah Valley and into Pennsylvania. The Confederates were met with resistance from local militia units, but they were able to push forward, driven by their desire to win a decisive victory on Union territory. Meanwhile, the Union Army was scrambling to respond, with General George Meade taking command of the Army of the Potomac and launching a series of hasty preparations to meet the Confederate invasion. As General George Meade took command of the Army of the Potomac, he faced a daunting task: to stop Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania and defend the North. Meade's army was still reeling from the defeat at Chancellorsville, and morale was low. However, Meade was a seasoned commander who had served with distinction in the Mexican-American War and had played a key role in several battles during the Civil War. He quickly set about assessing the situation and planning his response to Lee's invasion. Meade's first priority was to gather intelligence on Lee's army and its movements. He dispatched cavalry units to scout out the Confederate forces and report back on their strength, disposition, and intentions. Meanwhile, he began to concentrate his own army around the town of Gettysburg, which was strategically located at the crossroads of several important roads and highways. Meade knew that if he could defeat Lee's army at Gettysburg, he might be able to drive them out of Pennsylvania and back into Virginia. The town itself was a small rural community, with a population of just over 2,000 people. However, its strategic location made it an ideal place for a battle, and both Meade and Lee recognized its importance. On June 30, 1863, the advance guard of Lee's army, consisting of General Harry Heth's division, arrived on the outskirts of Gettysburg, where they encountered a brigade of Union cavalry under General John Buford. The Confederates were eager to drive the Union troops out of the way and secure the high ground to the west of town, which offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. However, Buford's men were determined to hold their ground, and they put up a fierce resistance against Heth's division. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they clashed in the streets and fields around Gettysburg. As the day wore on, more and more troops arrived on the scene, including General John Reynolds' corps of Union infantry, which had been marching towards Gettysburg all morning. Reynolds' men were fresh and well rested, and they threw themselves into the battle with enthusiasm, helping to drive back Heth's division and secure the high ground west of town. However, the Confederates were not easily defeated, and they continued to push forward, determined to take control of Gettysburg and the surrounding countryside. As the sun began to set on July 1, 1863, the battle was far from over. The Union and Confederate armies had clashed in a series of fierce engagements around Gettysburg, but neither side had emerged victorious. Meade's army had held its ground, but at great cost. Thousands of men had been killed or wounded, and many more were missing or captured. Lee's army had also suffered heavily, but it was still intact and ready to continue the fight. As night fell on Gettysburg, both armies regrouped and reassessed their positions. Meade knew that he had to hold the high ground south of town, which offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and protected his army's flanks. He ordered his men to dig in and prepare for another day of fighting, knowing that Lee's army would not give up easily. Meanwhile, Lee was facing his own set of challenges. His army was spread out over a wide area, and he was struggling to coordinate his troops and maintain control of the battlefield. He knew that he had to take the high ground south of town if he was going to have any chance of winning the battle, but Meade's army was well entrenched and determined to hold its ground. As the night wore on, both armies prepared for another day of fighting. The fate of the Union and the Confederacy hung in a balance as two great armies clashed in a struggle that would determine the course of American history. On the morning of July 2, 1863, Lee's army launched a massive assault on the Union positions south of town. The Confederates had spent the night regrouping and reorganizing their troops, and they were determined to take the high ground and drive Meade's army out of Gettysburg. The attack was led by General James Longstreet's corps, which consisted of some of the toughest and most experienced troops in the Confederate Army. As the Confederates advanced, they encountered fierce resistance from the Union troops, who were dug in behind a series of stone walls and earthworks. The Union lines were stretched thin, but Meade's men held their ground, determined to defend their positions against all odds. The battle raged on for hours, with neither side giving an inch. The Confederates made several attempts to outflank the Union army, but Meade's men were ready for them, and they repelled each attack with heavy losses. As the day wore on, the fighting grew more intense, with both sides suffering increasingly heavy casualties. One of the most famous incidents of the battle occurred on the afternoon of July 2nd, when a brigade of Union troops from the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment defended a strategic hill called Little Round Top against a series of fierce Confederate attacks. The Maine men were vastly outnumbered, but they held their ground, fighting bravely and inflicting heavy casualties on the Confederates. As the sun began to set on July 2nd, the battle was still raging, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. However, Meade's army had held its ground, and Lee's army had suffered heavily in the fighting. On the morning of July 3, 1863, Lee's army launched a final assault on the Union positions, known as Pickett's Charge. The attack was led by General George Pickett's division, which consisted of some of the finest troops in the Confederate Army. The Confederates advanced across open fields, exposed to withering fire from the Union artillery and infantry. The charge was a disaster for the Confederates, who suffered devastating losses as they advanced towards the Union lines. The Union artillery cut them down in droves, while the infantry poured volley after volley into their ranks. Despite their bravery, the Confederates were unable to break through the Union lines, and they were forced to retreat back to their own positions. As Pickett's charge failed, Lee's army began to withdraw from Gettysburg, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded soldiers. The battle was over, and Meade's army had emerged victorious. The Union had suffered heavily, with over 23,000 casualties, but the Confederacy had lost even more, with estimates ranging from 28,000 to 30,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the Civil War, marking a decisive shift in momentum towards the Union. Lee's army would never fully recover from the losses it suffered at Gettysburg, and the Confederacy would eventually be forced to surrender. As the news of the battle spread throughout the North, Americans began to realize that the war was finally beginning to turn in their favor. In the aftermath of Gettysburg, Meade's army pursued Lee's retreating forces, but they were unable to catch them before they crossed back into Virginia. The Union Army then settled into a series of defensive positions, waiting for Lee's next move. Meanwhile, Lincoln and his administration began to plan for the next phase of the war, knowing that the ultimate goal was still to defeat the Confederacy and restore the Union. As the summer of 1863 drew to a close, the Union Army began to shift its focus towards the Western Theater, where General Ulysses S. Grant had been making steady gains against the Confederacy. In July, Grant's forces had captured the strategic city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, Grant's army had defeated the Confederate Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Chickamauga, paving the way for a Union advance into Georgia. In the fall of 1863, President Lincoln appointed Grant as the General-in-Chief of all Union forces, tasking him with coordinating a comprehensive strategy to defeat the Confederacy. Grant quickly set to work, developing a plan to attack the Confederacy on multiple fronts simultaneously. In Virginia, Grant's army would face off against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, while in Georgia, Union forces under General William Tecumseh Sherman would march towards Atlanta, the industrial and transportation hub of the Confederacy. As Grant's army began its campaign against Lee, the two armies clashed in a series of bloody battles in the spring of 1864. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought on May 5th to 7th, was the first major engagement between the two armies, and it set the tone for the rest of the campaign. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's army held its ground, but Grant's forces continued to push forward, determined to wear down the Confederates through sheer force of numbers. Over the next several weeks, Grant's army clashed with Lee's forces at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Battle of North Anna, and the Battle of Cold Harbor. Each battle was more brutal than the last, with both sides suffering staggering losses. By the end of June 1864, Grant's army had suffered over 60,000 casualties, but it had also forced Lee's army to retreat towards Richmond, the capital of Virginia. Meanwhile, in Georgia, Sherman's army was making steady progress towards Atlanta. The city was a crucial target for the Union, as it was the industrial and transportation hub of the Confederacy. In July 1864, Sherman's forces captured the city of Marietta, just outside of Atlanta, and began to lay siege to the city itself. After several weeks of fighting, Confederate General John Bell Hood evacuated Atlanta on September 1, 1864, leaving the city in Union hands. The fall of Atlanta was a devastating blow to the Confederacy, as it deprived them of their main industrial and transportation center. The loss of the city also had significant political implications, as it helped to secure President Lincoln's re-election in November 1864. With the Union Army closing in on Richmond from the north and Sherman's forces marching through Georgia, the Confederacy was on the brink of collapse. In December 1864, Sherman's army began its famous March to the Sea, a campaign that would take them through the heart of Georgia and into South Carolina. The march was a masterpiece of military strategy, as Sherman's forces lived off the land, destroying Confederate infrastructure and supplies as they went. The march also had a profound psychological impact on the Confederacy, as it demonstrated the Union Army's ability to project power deep into enemy territory. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy was in its final death throes. In January, Sherman's forces captured the city of Savannah, Georgia, and began to march northwards towards South Carolina. Meanwhile, Grant's army was closing in on Richmond from the north, and Lee's army was running out of options. On April 2, 1865, Union forces broke through the Confederate lines at Petersburg, Virginia, and Lee's army was forced to retreat. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, effectively ending the Civil War. The news of the surrender sent shockwaves throughout the nation as Americans struggled to come to terms with the end of the conflict. Over the next several weeks, Confederate armies across the South surrendered, and the Union was finally restored. As the nation began to rebuild, the legacy of the Civil War continued to shape American society. The war had resulted in the deaths of an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers and civilians, and it had left deep scars on the national psyche. However, it had also brought about a new era of freedom and equality, as African Americans were finally granted their rights as citizens. The Civil War was a defining moment in American history, one that would continue to shape the nation for generations to come. The American Civil War was a pivotal moment in the nation's history, a crucible of fire and blood that tested the very foundations of the United States. It was a conflict that ultimately freed a people from the shackles of slavery, yet left deep scars that would take generations to heal. The war marked a turning point in the country's evolution, setting it on a path towards becoming the diverse, complex, and often contradictory nation we know today. The war may be over, but its legacy lives on, a powerful reminder of the enduring struggle for freedom, equality, and justice that has always defined America. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.